Hello and welcome to BachTalk. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I'm Carlton Monroe, director of the Bach Ensemble of St. Thomas, and I am joined, as always, by Adam Schoaf. Adam, good to see you. How are you?
Nice to see you. Doing very well. Thank you, Carlton.
All
Good to be
right.
back again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a momentous day here in Cincinnati because later this afternoon, the Cincinnati Bengals are going to be playing in the Super Bowl, which has forced Bach Talk to shift to an afternoon time instead of our normal evening chat, but that's okay. That's a worthy reason. And
Bach Talk
glad to have
tailgate.
several folks already joining us. That's wonderful. If you're joining live, remember you can chat with us if you have questions during the course of our presentation. I'll try to monitor those as best I can and make sure that we get to you. Today we are talking about the music that will be performed at our next Bach Vespers, which is coming up a week from today. And it's a little bit unique because we are not doing a cantata, which is our standard fare for Bach Vespers. But this time we are performing a motet of J.S. Bach, Jesu, meine Freude, BWV 227. And so Adam is going to talk a little bit about that. But first, he's got some fantastic things to talk life. So Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Bach didn't want to go away. One of the defining features that separates Bach's time in Leipzig from his previous places of employment was his extremely busy schedule. As the St. Thomas cantor and city music director, Bach had responsibilities for classroom teaching and student supervision, private musical instruction, providing music at the city's 4 main churches on Sundays and feast days, and shaping the city's musical life, among other duties. And if that were not enough, Bach added even more to his plate during his first years in Leipzig by choosing to compose challenging new cantatas on nearly a weekly basis, not to mention his Magnificat, the St. John and St. Matthew Passions, and possibly motets like Jesu, meine Freude. It was a grueling workload, and I can't help but wonder if he ever missed the comfortable court environments that he enjoyed in Weimar at Carlton, where cantata composition was much more infrequent, performances were more limited, and Bach didn't have to manage so many people. And so for today's special topic, I want to go a little deeper into what Bach's work week was like. Now, this topic is a little different from previous Bach talks, where we've looked at Bach's orchestra, or the Lutheran chorale, or Bach's librettists. Today's special topic is more personal. It's more biographical. I like to think that today we're going behind the music and we're going to look at Bach, the man himself. And we're going to look at his work schedule and how he managed the schedule and how he still managed to write all this great music at the same time. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Bach and his family lived at his workplace in the cantor's residential quarters within the St. Thomas School, which was right next door to the St. Thomas Church until the school was destroyed by bombing in 1944. Living in the school certainly provided Bach easy access to his daily activities, but also underscores the fact that for Bach, there was no such thing as work-life balance. And as we'll see, most of his waking hours were devoted to school and music duties. The St. Thomas School schedule governed Bach's personal schedule, and the school rigidly adhered to this schedule for all weekdays throughout the year, excluding religious holidays and the 3 periods during the year in which Leipzig hosted trade fairs. Generally, Bach began his workday at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. in winter. He had a lunch break at 11 a.m. and dinner at 6 p.m. The school dormitory's bedtime was 9 p.m., although Bach may have stayed up longer. His primary weekday duty as Thomas cantor was classroom teaching. Classes at St. Thomas were held from 7 to 10 a.m. and from 12 to 3 p.m. Of these 30 hours per week, cantors traditionally taught 12 classroom hours. 7 of these were devoted to music instruction, 4 to teaching Latin, and 1 to teaching catechism. Now, Bach could have taught the Latin and catechism classes. After all, he passed a theological exam in Latin as part of his Leipzig audition. However, Bach wanted more time for music, and so he arranged for a classics scholar at the St. Thomas School named Carl Friedrich Petzold to teach the 4 Latin classes and the catechism in exchange for compensation. This permanent substitute arrangement, by the way, was not something that Bach was doing under the table. The Leipzig city authorities had already approved of the agreement. So, with Bach's remaining 7 hours of instruction, he provided hour-long music classes, which were required for all of St. Thomas's approximately 150 students. If we take 150 students and divide them into 7 classes, it means that Bach had about 21 students per class. These 7 class sessions met at 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, and at 12 p.m. on Fridays. Sessions were held in the school's auditorium, which had a small organ and a harpsichord, and Bach was assisted in his music teaching by 4 choral prefects, sort of like student teachers, whom he selected from among his most talented students. The Bach scholar Christoph Wolff has speculated that the prefects tutored the younger students while Bach worked with the more advanced, and that Bach performed and demonstrated concepts while all students observed there in the auditorium. For teaching materials, Bach relied on at least one manual that he created, called Precepts and Principles for playing the thorough bass or accompanying in 4 parts, as well as drawing examples from the vocal and instrumental repertoire, either by himself or compositions available in the school library. Wolff has also proposed that Bach's motets, such as Jesu, meine, Freude, might have been composed for educational purposes. Outside of his regular classroom teaching, Bach had several extracurricular musical responsibilities. Now, this is where the reduction in Latin teaching time really paid off. Bach invested more time in private instruction than his predecessors did. He taught vocal and instrumental lessons to individuals and small groups, and he may have used this time to prepare his musicians for cantata performances. He also had more time then for ensemble rehearsals, which was essential given the additional difficulty of his music. These rehearsals took place in the St. Thomas Auditorium, the same place where the hour-long music classes took place. Being city music director also meant other miscellaneous musical functions. Bach and his St. Thomas musicians were engaged every week for funerals and weddings to such an extent that these became a major source of income for himself and his students. Music was also required for town or university celebrations or events for the Saxon royal family. And these were the events that inspired so many of Bach's secular cantatas. Now, I haven't even mentioned the local Collegium Musicum yet, but that was something that Bach didn't focus on so much until after 1729, when he had mostly set aside his composition of new church music. In addition to Bach's musical obligations, he also had other supervisory tasks as a member of the school faculty. He had to be on duty every Friday morning from 7 to 8 a.m. for the weekly prayer service. And then also for 1 week out of every month, Bach had to take his turn as a school inspector. And according to the regulations, I've given you the quote here on the screen, the inspector conducts morning and evening prayers. He sees that the school is called at 6 a.m. in winter, at 5 a.m. in summer, and that 15 minutes later, all are assembled for prayers in the auditorium downstairs. He says prayers again at 8 p.m. and is careful to note that none is absent and that no lights are taken into the dormitories. At meals, he must see that there is no boozing, that grace is said in German before and after meal, and that the Bible or a history book is read during the repast. It is his duty to make sure that the scholars return in full number and at the proper hour from attending funerals and weddings. Particularly, he must satisfy himself that none comes home having drunk too much. The inspector holds the key to the infirmary and visits the patients in it. Absence from his duty during the day entails a fine of 4 groschen and at night of 6. Now, I know that's a long quote, but it's pretty dense with all of the things that Bach had to do. And it gives us a sense of just how much there was that was part of his job. I think it makes him sound a little bit like a camp counselor. But it also shows that there were some days where he was pretty much on duty all day. So within this beehive of activity, it seems hard to believe that Bach found the time and the ability to concentrate on writing a new cantata, but somehow he did. So here's what we know about his weekly cantata routine. And I want to preface this by saying that this routine was most intense just during Bach's first 2 years in Leipzig, especially during the second year when he wrote his chorale cantata cycle. After 1725, he then began to slow the pace of new cantata production. But the production of a cantata started with pre-compositional work. He had to either select an existing libretto or work with a local poet to obtain one, and he had to select the chorales in conjunction with the local pastors. The libretti provided Bach with an order of movements for the cantata, we saw that last week, and the poetry itself would have given Bach numerous musical ideas. For example, the mood of the poem might suggest either a major or a minor key. The prosody, or the rhythmic pattern of the poetry, would prompt a certain meter or maybe suggest a rhythmic motive that Bach could use. Certain words might inspire standard melodic or harmonic figures. Obtaining the libretti usually happened weeks ahead of the performance, although chorales might not be decided until maybe a few days before the service. Once Bach had the text, he could begin composing the choruses, arias, recitatives, and chorales. This activity began on Monday, if not earlier. The composition had to be completed within a few days to allow enough time for copying out the individual parts by hand and for rehearsal. Remember, there are no copying machines back in that time. Bach started by applying the 5-line staves himself to blank pieces of paper and using a small rake-looking device called a rostrum. At the score over on the right side of your screen, that is a Bach autograph, and you can see that the staves are a little bit wavy, and that's an indication that they have not been printed, but someone drew them on themselves. At that point, once the staves are set down, Bach then began writing the opening chorus. The Bach scholar Robert Marshall published a 2-volume work in the 1970s on Bach's compositional process in the vocal works. And Marshall made a couple of interesting observations based on his study of Bach's scores. The first is that Bach was notably efficient in his use of paper. He would start writing a new movement immediately after the previous one had ended, sometimes even continuing on the very same line. This all suggests that he was possibly composing the movements in the same order that they would be performed. You can see the concise use of paper again on the score here on the screen too. This is an autograph score of a Bach cantata, BWV 65, Sie werden aus Saba alle kommen, and Bach has the opening chorus there at the top, but you can see down at the bottom, there are several musical lines squeezed in. That's a different movement. It comes from a chorale, and Bach is putting it all on the same page in order to save paper. But the other thing that Marshall noted, he states that there's a curious difference between Bach's earlier and later vocal works. The earlier works, the cantatas written in Weimar, tend to have fewer corrections at the beginning of movements when the themes are initially introduced, but then more corrections later on as the young Bach perhaps ran into contrapuntal difficulties. On the other hand, the Leipzig cantatas show more corrections at the beginning of movements as Bach carefully refined an idea at the outset. And then once he established an idea to his liking, his mature technical mastery allowed him to proceed quickly. And the rest of the movement reveals a very brisk handwriting and few corrections. At any rate, Bach had to finish the score of his cantata by Wednesday so that the half dozen movements could be copied out on Thursday. Since, as I said before, Bach did not have to teach on Thursdays, he could organize and supervise the copying effort, which involves student copyists working at tables in the cantor's office and in the school library. Bach could then review the performance materials, make any corrections, enter dynamic markings, slurs, and ornamentation, and add bass figures in the continuo part. Once the parts were then prepared, this is for all instrumental parts, all vocal parts, once they were prepared, the cantata could be rehearsed, although this generally involved no more than one complete read-through on a Saturday. Now, having presented this weekly routine, I do want to point out a problem that has confounded Bach researchers in the past. It's thought that Bach might have used some of his Monday to Wednesday classroom time for cantata rehearsal. But then how could he do this if he were only just composing the cantata between Monday and Wednesday? Well, Robert Marshall has suggested that perhaps Bach composed his cantatas at a weekly rate, but always more than a week in advance. This still would have been a grueling pace, but keeping ahead of schedule by a week or two would have allowed Bach more rehearsal time and kept the cantata production from being a constantly stressful last-minute affair. Let's switch gears now. So I'm going to set aside Bach's work week because I want to say a few words about the Bach Motets that we're going to hear next week, and then just about Bach's motets collectively. We don't actually know how many motets Bach wrote in his life. Today, most of the motets fall within the BWV range of 225 to 230, although there is some doubt about whether BWV 230 is truly by Bach. And just a reminder, this BWV numbering system came along in the 1950s. This is not Bach's numbering system. If you do some digging, you will find that there are some other motets in the BWV catalog that have since been attributed to other composers, or they represent arrangements that Bach made of other composers' motets. But BWV 225 to 230, that's your main block of original motets. Now, one of the important points that I'd like for you to take away from this talk is that the motets, even in Bach's day, were an archaic genre. Even to Bach's listeners, they would have sounded traditional. And this makes the motets different from the church cantatas. If you tuned into the last Bach talk, you might remember how I said that Bach's cantatas were incorporating new and modern styles of recitative and aria, borrowed from fashionable Italian opera. And this was a little controversial for some listeners. The motets, on the other hand, don't include recitatives and arias. It's all multi-voice polyphony, sometimes making use of chorale themes in the tradition of 17th century composers like Heinrich Schütz. For Bach's listeners, the difference between a traditional motet and a modern cantata would have been as apparent as the difference between a traditional hymn and a pop-influenced praise song is apparent to us today. All right, and so because Bach's listeners would have heard a difference, I think it's important that we are aware of this difference too. So how old is the motet? Well, if this is a new term for you, they're very old. The motet first developed in Paris in the early 13th century. In fact, motet comes from the French mot, meaning word. The motet changed in style over the course of its long popularity from the late Middle Ages through the Renaissance and into the Baroque era, but throughout it remained essentially a work of sacred vocal polyphony apart from the Mass. With the Lutheran Reformation, German composers began creating polyphonic settings of German texts, often weaving in the chorale melodies that defined the new faith. This tradition continued through Heinrich Schütz and also included some of Bach's composer ancestors. In fact, there's a collection of manuscripts known as the Old Bach Archive that preserves compositions from the Bach family, including motets by Johannes Bach, Johann Michael Bach, and Johann Christoph Bach. This collection was originally put together by Bach's father, but it passed into Bach's hands, and he was able to study its contents. Scholars today think that these earlier family compositions may have served as an important source of inspiration for Bach's own motets. Now, by the 18th century, the motet had lost its luster for composers who were drawn to new Baroque-era concerto techniques or operatic styles. But motets hadn't entirely disappeared from church musical life. Services in Leipzig during Bach's time began with the 16th or 17th century motet, and Bach had to prepare his St. Thomas singers to perform them. Now, there are some important questions that we have about Bach's own motets. And the first might be this: if the motet was an archaic genre, if it was fading away as a genre, why did Bach write these pieces in the first place? And the truth is, we don't actually know the purpose for any of these motets. It's long been thought that they were originally intended to be sung at funerals, but so far there's kind of a lack of concrete evidence linking the motets to specific funerals. Christoph Wolff has suggested that the motets were originally composed for pedagogical purposes, and that they provided vocal exercise, compositional lessons in writing for 3, 4, or 5 parts, or for double chorus for some of the other motets, and then also a reinforcement of Lutheran theology, all within one practice piece. This too is an intriguing hypothesis, but once again, we still lack concrete evidence to support it. Another important unknown regarding the motets is their dates of composition. It's hard to pin down exactly when they were written. Scholars believe that most of the motets date from the first half of the Leipzig period, so from 1723 to about 1735. Although at least one motet, BWV 228, is thought to date from the Weimar years. There's even disagreement about the motet that we'll hear next week, Jesu, meine, Freude. This motet has traditionally been thought to date to Bach's first years in Leipzig. However, one Bach scholar, Daniel Melamed, finds elements that suggest to him a pre-Leipzig origin, maybe in the 17 teens. But then another Bach scholar, Richard Jones, looks at the style and suggests that it comes from the late 1720s. So this just goes to show that even very experienced analysts can come to very different conclusions, even about the same work. Regarding BWV 227, Jesu, meine, Freude, there are some things that we can state with confidence. We know that this motet at 11 movements is Bach's longest and most complex motet. It's probably also the most frequently performed of the motets, and it's easy to see why. It combines a series of very beautiful movements featuring a variety of textures and styles within a very clever, symmetrical architectural design, and we'll look at that design in just a minute. But my point is, people tend to find this motet very enjoyable, very satisfying on multiple levels. Now, I want to give you 3 important tips about the motet to kind of prep you for next week. The first is that the texts for each movement alternate. And I've listed the movements here on the screen. The odd-numbered movements, and there are 6 of them, use the 6 verses from Johann Franck's chorale, Jesu, meine, Freude, which Franck wrote in 1650. Bach also uses the chorale melody in some form in each of these 6 movements. The even-numbered movements each use a single verse from Romans chapter 8, and it's verses 1 through 2, and then verses 9 through 11. These verses from Romans talk about life in the Spirit and the triumph of the Spirit over the flesh. Okay, so here on the slide, I show you the alternation of the text. I put the Romans in red just to make it stand out a little bit easier for you. The second important point that I want to make about this motet is its overall symmetrical or arch structure. This is an aspect of the piece that can elude people if you just listen to it without being aware ahead of time that this structure exists. And I've tried to show the parallel movements here on the screen. The color doesn't have any particular significance. It's just meant to show, better show the arch along with the indentations. So the outer movements, movements 1 and 11, have exactly the same music. They give us a very simple 4-part chorale setting. Movements 2 and 10 have very similar music as well. Movement 10 is a bit shorter, but the opening is a clear echo of movement 2. Both of these movements have a mix of homophony, in other words, everyone singing together in chords, and then also short fugue-like sections. That's why I call it a fugato movement. Movements 3 and 5 find their parallels in movements 7 and 9. All of these are more elaborate chorale settings. Movements 3 and 5 are for 5 voices. Movements 7 and 9 are for 4 voices. The movement 4 trio for soprano, soprano, alto is mirrored by the movement 8 trio for alto, tenor, bass. And then finally, the capstone of the entire work, number 6, is not the longest in terms of measures, but it's certainly the most imposing movement in its construction. It is a double fugue for 5 voices. In other words, Bach introduces one theme and then he works it through all 5 voices. And then he introduces a second theme and he works that through all 5 voices. And then as kind of a climactic virtuosic gesture, he takes both themes together and works them through all 5 voices at the same time. The third and final tip I want to give you relates to the dramatic contrast that Bach establishes between the spirit and the flesh in several movements of the motet. I had said that spirit and flesh, or in German, Geist und Fleisch, was the theme of Paul's message in Romans. Well, Bach picks up on this, and he juxtaposes Geist and Fleisch in different ways. And I've just given you a few of them on the screen here. So in movement 2, Bach uses very solid, confident chords, or homophony, to talk about those who are in Christ. But then when the text talks about walking according to the flesh, Bach switches to a polyphonic texture in which the 5 voices seem to be wandering in 5 different directions. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Handel's chorus from Messiah, "All we like sheep," where the different parts are wandering in different directions. In movement 6, the first fugue theme sets the word fleischlich, or of the flesh, to a very short, simple held note. But then whenever he gets to the word geistlich, then suddenly the fugue theme just sort of flourishes out into this long, kind of joyful melisma. And then one more example, in movement 8, Bach distinguishes between the body, or the Leib, Leib is German for body, which is dead in sin, and then the spirit, or the Geist, which is alive. So then in the body phrases, in the Leib phrases, Bach takes us through this kind of dark forest of minor keys. We go to D minor, and then A minor, E minor, G minor, and it gives us a lot of very dissonant and chromatic notes. And all of this is meant to symbolize death and decay. But then when the text switches to the spirit bringing life, Bach suddenly turns on the lights, and we get music in major keys and a return to the long and joyful melismas. So anyway, these are just a few of the examples. You'll find lots of text painting in the motet, but you have to remember that Bach isn't just about painting the images, painting the words that he reads on the page. Really what he's doing is he's dramatizing this theological point about living in the spirit versus living in the flesh. And this is a distinction that he makes in so many of his cantatas. It's often the source of his drama, this juxtaposing of 2 separate things. It's such a part of Bach's art, and then Baroque art in general, this kind of chiaroscuro, dark and light. Moving around to the end for further study. If you'd like to learn more about Bach's work week, I would recommend Christoffels' biography, Johann Sebastian Bach, the learned musician. It originally came out in 2000 and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. There is a revised edition that came out in 2013 to reflect more recent research. There are other Bach biographies out there, but this one is so packed with information that it's still an important source. I think it's still kind of considered the gold standard among Bach biographies. I used it for much of the material that I put together today, and it seems like I use it almost every week when I put these together. The other book I can recommend, if you'd like to know more about Bach's motets, is Daniel Malamud's J.S. Bach and the German Motet. This book deals with Bach's motets and then also the motets of his predecessors. And it also talks a little bit about Bach's interest in this older style, what scholars call the stile antico, or the antique style, or this motet style, and how Bach uses it in some of his other works, especially in the cantatas. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. Carlton, we can bring you back on.
Here we go. Fantastic. That was unbelievable. I actually learned something I had never heard before about Bach's change in the way he revised music over time, that in the earlier works, he tended to revise more later in pieces, whereas in the later works, he was revising the initial material first.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
that's really interesting to me because
Pretty crazy.
yeah, well, and
That's
it
something I
definitely
learned as I was putting it together too.
yeah, yeah, and it implies that he one of the amazing things about well, I was thinking about the double fugue in Jesu, meine, Freude that you pointed out as the central piece, and you know, I was as you were explaining it, I was trying to convey, okay, you know, an equivalent, a descriptive equivalent to writing a double fugue, right? And so I thought to myself, so it's kind of like juggling axes over here, 3 axes, right? And then juggling 3 chainsaws over here, and then juggling all 6 all at once. That's basically composing a
That's the
double
double
fugue.
fugue. Yep, yep, yeah. Yeah, that was something I learned this week as I was getting things together too. That was something I hadn't known before. It kind of reminds me though of there was a quote attributed to Bach's son Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, where Carl said that growing up, he said that his father could hear a theme, and then he would tell Carl, here's what you can do with it. You can invert the theme, you can augment it, you can switch it around in different ways, do it in diminution. And then whenever in the performance those things would happen, Carl said his father would kind of nudge him. It's like, see, I told you, there it is.
Yeah,
But yeah, it just kind of shows how he could kind of see his musical material, know what he could do with it, know what he wanted to do with it, and then he could just sort of I almost want to say the piece kind of writes itself, but
right.
maybe for him it sounds like it kind of did, just as he gained that maturity.
Or it's like maybe looking at a chessboard and being able to say, okay, if you do this next, here's how that plays out, right? Or if you did this next, here's how that plays out, and this is all going on in his head.
Yeah.
The other thing I learned was that I clearly do not work hard enough in my job. I can't even fathom his weekly schedule. That was really incredible.
You don't have to watch over kids in the dormitory and
right. Although I have a little bit of that. It's just not a 24-hour concern for me. So the only things that I wanted to add were performing this motet, Jesu, meine, Freude. This is a motet that I have wanted to do for many, many years, and I have never done it, in part because the choral demands are so immense. It is an incredibly difficult piece to sing, and that leads me to wonder about, what you were addressing. What was the purpose of these pieces? And in some ways, Jesu, meine, Freude is significantly different than the other motets by Bach that we currently have. But none of them make sense in my mind. I can't figure out what was the typical use for them in any services, because even the motets that, as you said, that services began with were a completely different musical animal, usually much shorter, much less complex. And so I can't even imagine these pieces replacing those in any service. And just my view is that the hypothesis about them being instructional tools rings really true to me, to my sense, just having known them as musical entities. They're so difficult. Some of the variety of texture that Bach explores in these that you don't see anywhere else. For example, one of the movements in this motet is written for soprano, soprano, alto, and tenor, and just removes the bass voice continually, completely, excuse me. And it creates such an unusual texture. It's one of the most magical moments in this motet, and you don't see that anywhere else in Bach's choral writing. And so it just struck me as such a unique voicing for him to use. And then the two trios, the SSA and the ATB trios, are also very unique. And so, and the theological underpinnings of the work, which you mentioned too, the centerpiece, that double fugue, the text is, "But you are not of the flesh, you are of the spirit." And that's the center of the entire piece. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that these could have been very challenging educational tools for his singers and for his students. Otherwise, I can't really see how they would have been used. The funeral hypothesis doesn't resonate with me because I think these pieces we do have evidence of music that Bach wrote for funerals, and they tend to not come anywhere near the complexity of some of these motets too. So it's interesting, yes. but I don't. We'll never know that answer. We can only have opinions. So
yeah, I think I tend to agree with you too. I think as I was thinking about the possible educational use, you look at the way he uses the different voices, and even in the double fugue, the way he brings in voices in different orders, it's almost like he's saying, well, you could do it like this, or you could do it like this. And
yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Well, this was fantastic. To everyone joining us live today, thank you for tuning in. We hope that you will come next Sunday for the Bach Vespers service. It should be a wonderful service as we get to perform Jesu, meine, Freude. So with that, I think we will sign off. Adam, thanks as always, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in just a couple of weeks, because our next Bach Vespers it was only 2 weeks away from this one. So we'll be back together quickly.
Yeah, a couple of weeks. I've already been looking into the material for next time. I think the special topic for next time we'll look at church life and church activities and what that was like.
Excellent.
I've been doing some research already, and I've found some things that I think people are going to find it interesting. How many things change, and then how many things haven't changed. So some things will seem very familiar, other things a little bizarre. So be sure to
Excellent. Tune in. That's great. All right. Well, thanks to everyone, and hooday. Let's hope the Bengals get a victory today, and we'll see everybody again soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Carlton.